Hello and welcome to the Max MPS Radio. My name is Jan Frisse and today I'm again joined by Jacob Schepis from Australia, who was on the show before, back in March if I'm correct. And we will talk about specialization training for physique athletes, and I know you have quite some experience with that, so I'm definitely excited to pick your brain on that topic. Happy to have you on the show again, Jacob, and welcome.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it, man. It's good to be back.
Cool. Just maybe since the show has grown quite a bit, maybe you can introduce yourself again real quick.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know who I am, which is probably the vast majority of you, I'm Jacob Schepis. I live in Australia, in Melbourne, actually. I'm a personal trainer in Melbourne. I have two facilities, JPS Health and Fitness, and we coach bodybuilders, powerlifters. We also work with the general population who just want to get strong and look better naked. And I'm a competitive bodybuilder, so I've been building my body since I was 16 years old, which is when I first got into the gym. So nearly 12 years now. So it's been a while since I've been pumping iron. I have competed in bodybuilding back in 2012, 2013. I won a number of titles, a couple of international titles, and then I went into the world of powerlifting not long after that, where I came second in nationals in the IPF and did quite well there. And since then this was back in 2015, since then I've really just focused on my business and my little family. So my own training has taken a little bit of a backseat, as I discussed with Jean earlier before we went on air. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell, man. I love lifting. I love teaching people how to lift and the science behind what we do on the gym floor. And I guess something I'm really passionate about is being able to take the evidence and the theoretical understanding we do have of building muscle, strength, and losing fat and these types of things, and applying it in the real world and making it easy to understand for myself, my clients, other people, so they can get the best results possible.
Absolutely, and I can only tell everybody to check out your and your team's content. It's absolutely awesome. I love it. And you actually have started the mentorship program or something, if I'm correct?
Yeah, man. Yeah, so we just started JPS Education. I've been mentoring personal trainers since 2013. It was something that I was coaching a lot of coaches, and people, they just wanted advice. They would ask me, what do I do, with my clients? Can you mentor me? And this and that. And at the time I was like, mentor? Because I'd never had a mentor myself. Like back in 2013, these kind of things didn't really exist in the fitness industry. It was still very new. Well, at least I didn't know of anything like this back then. It was, social media was still in its infancy and whatnot. And so I started mentoring coaches one-on-one, and it eventually transpired to a 12-week course where I would take a number of coaches in Melbourne through this mentorship and basically teach them what not to do. So all the mistakes that I made and how they can avoid them, really. But yeah, we've progressed it since then, and now we have a 12-week online course starting next year. I'm very honored to have a number of experts and industry leaders contributing. So we've got Mike Israetel, James Krieger, Danny Lennon, Brian Miner. We've got Steve Hall and Pascal, Aaron Brown from Myonomics. We've got a lot of really, really intelligent guys. And I guess why I got them on was because I didn't want it to be just my spin on fitness and coaching. I wanted it to be truly evidence-based, which means getting experts from a specific field to present and teach our students everything they need to know about that in a coaching aspect. So yeah, I'm really excited for that next year, man.
Yeah, sounds awesome. And I remember how much actually I did the SBS Academy, and how much that actually helped me in my career as a trainer. And I can only imagine that your program is super, super good as well. So I just gave you the opportunity to plug it in the beginning. So,
thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, going on with today's topic. Actually, we want to talk about specialization training for physique athletes. And I will start it with a pretty broad question, but I think it's a good one to start with. And it's actually who needs specialization training in bodybuilding?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because as lifters, I think we always tend to overestimate our abilities. You know, if someone's been in the gym for 5 years, they think they're advanced when, you know, they've only been training with a decent program for, say, 6 months and their muscularity and strengths, you know, that of an early intermediate at best, but they think they're advanced. So I think firstly, yeah, people need to have a really good hard look and objective assessment at their ability levels as well as their development. And this can also, you know, there's two ends of the spectrum here. So people are usually overestimating their ability and size, so they think they're really advanced and they are really jacked and they've reached their genetic potential. You know, they might have done a fat-free mass calculator and, you know, seen that they have, you know, an 25, you know, reading on that, and that's, you know, telling them they're at their genetic potential when, you know, in reality they're just not. Yeah. Or on the other end of the spectrum, we have those individuals who are quite well developed, but they're just very, very critical of themselves, and they think that they're never, you know, big enough, and they're, you know, to some degree they have, you know, body dysmorphia, and they think that they're just so small, and they don't actually appreciate that they're, you know, quite well developed and advanced. So I think first, people need to really objectively look at their development and more so do that from where they started. So, you know, their starting point. So if you're someone who started training and you had a really well-developed chest and now your chest is only slightly bigger than what it was when you started, even though it might look really big in comparison to your other muscle groups, it may not be an advanced muscle group. Where in comparison, if you started with really, really small arms and now you have really, really jacked arms, they might be advanced relative to their starting point. So I think the first thing to look at is take an objective assessment at your starting point, relative, your current muscularity, that is, relative to your starting point. And this will give you a really good understanding of how developed certain muscle groups are. So when you need one, back to answer your question, is at the advanced level or at the late intermediate phases of training. So beginners will likely not need specialization phases because they won't have specific weak points yet. And I guess we first need to define what a specialization phase is. So it's a phase of training that specifically targets weak muscle groups or lagging muscle groups and prioritizes the training variables in a manner that aims to optimize that muscle group in question, right? So we can start to pick that apart and say, cool, well, when do we have weak points and a lagging muscle group? And like I said, it's a great tool to assess objectively where are you at now relative to your starting point, and also to think about your training level of advancement. So not just in your muscularity, but your strength on certain lifts and in certain muscle groups. So you need to look both from a very subjective manner, so how do I look? Yeah. But then you need to use objective metrics such as your performance. And if you're benching 2 times body weight, well, it's going to be pretty obvious that your chest, your delts, and your triceps are going to be pretty advanced. But if you're still benching 1 times body weight, well, you're not advanced yet by any stretch of the imagination, and you either, you know, have really poor neuromuscular efficiency on the bench press and just don't understand the mechanics of the lift, or you just aren't very big at all, because those two things usually tie in together, because we know that a bigger muscle, all else being equal, will be able to produce more force, meaning that, you know, size and strength, well, strength rather can be a good proxy for muscular development when the neural side of things is kept constant. And I would almost say that, you know, you should be looking to improve 5 rep max strength and 8 rep max strength as opposed to your 1 RM strength for hypertrophy. But nonetheless, as you advance, your rate of progress will slow down, and therefore you need to dedicate specific phases of your training to areas and muscle groups you wish to bring up. And this is because your adaptive resources, so your adaptive potential essentially, slows down significantly, and you need to dedicate as much recovery to that specific muscle group so that you can make adaptations where you want to make those adaptations. Because if you're trying to generalize your training, you're trying to bring up all of those muscle groups, and you're doing, for example, high volume training for every single muscle group in your body, at the advanced level, you cannot adapt that quickly. You have diminished potential to adapt, because the muscle protein synthetic response to training becomes dampened with consistent exposure, the repeated bout effect, all these sorts of things as we train. So when you're advanced or at the late intermediate phases of your training, when progress has really slowed down, you've identified that a muscle group is not where it should be or it's lagging, then you can dedicate an entire phase towards bringing up that muscle group. And I guess we're going to get into how to structure that now. But I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a fantastic summary. I think Mike Isertel did like a good job of explaining it with like this. I think systemic MRV or system MRV. That actually you want to specialize when you like whole body when all the body part MRVs will overcome the systemic MRV, and I think that's, yeah, I mean, it's pretty theoretic, but I like to think about it like you have like capacities to recover training, and if actually every body part overcomes that whole capacity that you have, you actually need to specialize. So I would be interested in what your thoughts are on prioritizing strong points versus weak points in relation to training age.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think as you become more and more advanced, your strong points are going to remain strong no matter what you do. For me, I can use myself as an example. My quads and my hamstrings are a strong point, and no matter what I do, as long as I do just some training, there was a phase there where I was training my legs once every 10 days. With literally 5 sets for the quads and five sets for the hamstrings. So super low volumes, and they just didn't go anywhere. I think the areas that we have really well developed muscles in don't need a hell of a lot of training comparative to those weaker muscle groups. So I think as you become more advanced and those strong points are as strong as what they're going to be, or nearly where they should be, then you do need to start focusing on weak muscle groups, because if you're competing in bodybuilding, you need to bring those muscle groups up so that you do have that X frame. You've got symmetry across your muscles. So, for example, your biceps are the same or at least a similar size to your calves. So if you have really well-developed biceps, and they're near the point of reaching their, genetic max or their natty max, then you need to bring up your calves, because if you go on stage, then that's going to be a serious weak point. You will get marked down and you might not place as well. You might miss out on a pro card because you simply haven't dedicated time to training that weak point. Whereas, some individuals, they just don't care about their weak points. And if that's the case, well, then you can continue to make your strong points stronger. But I think that comes at the cost of leading to imbalances. And, in some muscle groups, if we have imbalances, for example, just in the quads to the hamstrings, you could see that kind of imbalance affect your ability to continually develop your strong point. So in antagonist muscle groups, you need to have at least some small degree of balance, or within proximity of one another at least, so that they're working synergistically to be able to develop their strong point and vice versa. Because otherwise the hamstrings will become the rate limiting factor in your ability to squat, and vice versa. Your quads will become a rate limiting factor in your ability to continually deadlift more. So I think, on that end, it's important to develop all muscle groups to a point where they contribute positively, both aesthetically and in terms of your performance.
So do you think there's never really like a time point where in a training career where someone should focus their strong points?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's always an opportunity to focus on a strong point. You don't need to necessarily only dedicate training to weak points, because making your strong points stronger, if you still haven't reached your genetic potential for that particular muscle group, is definitely a worthwhile investment, because you can make gains, and you should make gains if you can. There's no point like holding a muscle group back just for the sake of it. I think if you can build muscle for a particular muscle group, then yes, those strong points should be continued to be developed until they reach their genetic max, and then you can start prioritizing those weak points. And I definitely think that that's what people should do from the onset. Is if you have a strong point, get that motherfucker as strong as you can, and as big as you can, and then start worrying about the weak points later. Really capitalize on that ability to grow early on, because then you'll find out what's weak and what's not. And you can learn a lot through developing, those muscle groups anyway, provided you're paying attention. So yes, I think it's definitely worthwhile investment early on in your career. If you have a strong point and you're building muscle there, keep building muscle there. Don't worry about your weak points just yet. Just keep building as much muscle as you can. When the time comes, you'll become more advanced, and at least you have a massive chest, and at least you have massive arms, and then it's like, okay, shit, I need to work a bit more on my lats, and you can do that. So yeah, I think holding back development just for the sake of it is not a good idea.
Yeah, probably a lot of people just start to specializing weaker muscle points too early, and they will actually hold their strong points back to their their genetic limit of their weak points or their genetic potential.
For sure. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, going on with like mesocycle structure or training structure. I know you have done like an arm and shoulder specialization, if I'm not wrong, and I want to actually talk about that later on. But more so right now, I want to talk about the theory behind specialization training on the mesocycle structure, and how you usually go about structuring a mesocycle, and what variables you change, and what variables maybe stay the same, at least in the beginning.
Yeah, fantastic. So firstly, I think we need to discuss the duration of a specialization phase before we even get into the variables that we manipulate, because this is where I also see people really screw up their specialization phases. They either do it for too long or just not long enough. And usually, we need an appropriate amount of time, and we need to put some constraints on what appropriate is. So I think doing a specialization phase for one mesocycle, and let's say that mesocycle lasts, 4 to 6 weeks, simply isn't long enough. Because hypertrophy adaptations require consistent exposure to tension. And I like Berger for Jurley's summary of what muscle is and what causes it to grow. It's just dumb meat that responds to tension, and it grows when there is more tension over time. And we need to keep that in mind. So 5 weeks, if you're advanced and you have a weak point, is simply not long enough to see any significant development in that muscle group. So
agree.
For me, the duration of a specialization phase doesn't mean just one mesocycle. It needs to be at least, in my opinion, 2 to 3, at the very least. So I would say 10 weeks or more. And realistically, you can't build an appreciable amount of muscle at the advanced level as well in just one mesocycle. So I think it makes sense to keep specialization blocks to a period of at least 2 to 3 months. And this ensures there is sufficient duration and exposure to tension, as well as detectable changes in both performance, so that objective metric that we're looking at. So we want to see performance improvements for those muscle groups in question. And we also want to see the subjective measures increase as well. So if you're taking progress photos, girth measurements, and things like that, we want to be able to detect and assess those changes. So now that we've got that out of the way, I guess we can move on to the variables. So obviously the big variable at play when we talk about specialization is training volume. Now, to show that we're comparing apples with apples and that we're all on the same page when I speak of training volume, I'm talking about number of hard sets per week, per muscle group, with the caveat of being between the 6 to 20 rep range and an RPE of 6 or more. So we're putting some constraints on the intensity of load and effort there by giving those parameters. So training volume is a big variable that we want to be manipulating. And there are 2 options, in my opinion, for approaching a specialization phase when it comes to training volume. So number one is we can increase training volume for the target muscle group and lower volumes in the other muscle groups to maintenance or maybe slightly above. And as you pointed out, Jean, that lowers the total recovery cost because we're not performing as much volume across the board, across all muscle groups. And that provides more adaptive resources to go towards that specialization muscle because simply more volume is going to be more fatiguing. So we need that recovery to go towards that. But number two, and this is something that I've spoken to my colleague in the JPS mentorship, Brian Miner, about, is the potential to just reduce volume on other muscle groups and keep the volume for the target muscle group the same. Because what this will do is, again, it has the same effect as that first option, but without additional volume. So it's trying to eke out progress and see if we can get more gains with the same volume, which I think is really, really useful because you only want to add more volume when necessary. People have become very, trigger happy, I guess, since, the rise in evidence-based fitness and the literature supporting the efficacy of increasing volume with more and more hypertrophy. People become trigger happy and just add more volume to get more gains. When I think it's beneficial to look at your program a little more critically and think of other ways to get progress without necessarily adding more volume. And for me, my first point in call when I approach a specialization phase for myself or my athletes is to reduce volume of other muscle groups and keep the volume for the target muscle group the same because, like I said, this allows us to have more recovery resources to go towards that muscle group, which means we're going to get more adaptations most of the time, and this might lead to enhanced progress. Now, this also works really well when we start to manipulate the other variables to specifically target that muscle group. So, I guess before we get into those variables, we need to talk about another variable that is inextricably related to training volume, and that's frequency. So if you don't increase your training volume, so you're taking option 2 there, you can still increase your frequency, which allows for better quality work, and it's just a tool to distribute your volume to make sure that you are recovering and you are performing really well. So that's really useful. And again, if you choose option 1, which is to increase the volume, you're going to likely need to increase the frequency so that you can spread that volume in and that you're recovering well and you're able to perform at a decent level. So you're not seeing, drop off in performance because you're doing 10 sets in a single workout for a muscle group. You're going to get, a better training effect doing 5 sets twice a week than 10 in, one session, for example. So frequency is the next big variable that we can manipulate in a specialization phase. And generally speaking, it should go up because you'll get better performance, and especially if volume is increasing, which it will, and I'll get to that a little bit more as to how we progress a specialization phase. Your frequency should go up because it's just more exposure to tension, more volume. And we know, with great amount of certainty from the literature and in my experience as well with my specialization phases that, increases in volume over time in these specialization phases, whether you choose that option 1 of increasing initially or option 2, which is, keeping the volume the same, you will need to progress your volume as the phase goes on to make sure that you are, getting the most out of it. But the third variable that we need to look at is intensity. And that is measured in 2 ways. So typically it's intensity of load, which is the powerlifting community's, percentage of 1 rep max. It's still useful, and especially on your big key lifts, such as your squat, your bench, your deadlift. I still like to use percentage of 1 RM for these lifts, and then using the other way we can measure intensity, which is the quote-unquote bodybuilding method, and that's intensity of effort. So this is, our proximity to failure. So how close we are to failure, and we can measure that through repetitions in reserve or the RPE scale. And generally, for hypertrophy, we want to be training with intensity of loads. I would say anywhere from 60 to 85%. You can go lower, you can go higher, you can get growth with a very broad spectrum of intensities, but for the most part, you want to be between that 60 to 85% range, and you want an RPE of between 6 to 10. So what's important to remember is that intensity is inversely related to volume. So when volume goes up, intensity generally needs to stay the same or be lowered because jacking up intensity and volume simultaneously is a very, very quick way to non-functional overreaching. So basically, for those of you who may not be aware of what non-functional overreaching is, it's simply when you exceed your recovery capacity unintentionally. And that's not what we want to happen, because we want recovery, because that's how we get adaptation. So very important to remember that you don't get bigger unless you're recovering. And Obviously. If you jack up intensity and you jack up volume too quickly and too much, then you will overreach, you won't be able to recover, which means you are not going to adapt, and that has, negative implications long term. So you need to make sure that if you are increasing your volume, that you very, very closely moderate your intensity to ensure that you are recovering. So you need to make sure that intensity is at the right levels. So like I said, between 60 to 85% of 1RM, generally between that 6 to 10 RPE. But if you're putting up the volume, you need to closely monitor your recovery, especially in these specialization phases. And I just did my second arm specialization phase, and I was probably a little bit too eager with the intensities, and my fucking joints got really beat up really, really quickly because I was doing so many fucking bicep curls, so many tricep push downs, and I was just going too hard and too heavy, and lo and behold, my joints, my wrist started, giving me this pain, and I started to get a bit of pain in my elbow, and I had to pull the volume back. And as soon as I pulled the volume back, I was like, hey, presto, things got better. So really important to make sure that you moderate these things really closely. And a good way to do that is, if you're recovering, progress intensity of effort over the course of a mesocycle, but you need to make sure that you also, with these higher volumes, include days with higher RPEs and days with lower RPEs. So dependent on the exercise usually. And what I mean by this is, in a bicep specialization phase, you might have an exercise such as an incline dumbbell curl, and comparatively to, say, a preacher curl, this is a lot more disruptive and stressful because of the length tension curve. We have, different joint angles. There's, simply a greater range of motion, and there's more stress, disruption, damage to the fibers. And you might want to train that movement with a lower RPE, because if you train that movement with a higher RPE, you're going to cause way more disruption and damage and joint stress. And therefore, that's going to diminish your recovery capacity. And if you're doing such high volumes, that's going to be problematic. Whereas on the preacher curl, you could train that with higher RPEs simply because it's less disruptive. You're training, with elbow flexion. The joint angles are different. The length tension curves and the active tension on the muscle is significantly different. And therefore, you can push the intensity slightly more. So you really need to think long and hard about how you set up your specialization phases, because not all volume is created equally, and you're jacking up volume for the most part, and your intensity is also increasing, intensity of effort, and you need to be really careful so that you don't functionally overreach. And especially when you're doing all of this volume for just one muscle group, that one joint is going to cop a fucking hell of a lot of stress. And like I said, we need to do this over 10 or more weeks, which means it needs to be sustainable. We really need to make sure that we're recovering and we're not getting too excited, going too hard, too early. So I guess that's just a little bit of a tangent on the intensity side of things. And again, just remember, guys, that not all volume is created equally. And when we define volume in terms of programming, we look at it as number of hard working sets per week. But when we look at it on a very granular level, on the exercise comparison level, we can see that volume is reps times sets times load times distance traveled. And we also have to take into consideration the type of contraction, whether it's concentric, eccentric, the length tension relationship, whether the contraction is through the shortened position. For example, doing your side raises with dumbbells, you're primarily getting a stimulus on the lateral head of the delt when it's in a shortened and contracted position. This is a lot less fatiguing and damaging than training through a stretch position, which you might do on your leaning cable raise, because that's training the lateral delt through a very different mechanical position, and therefore you're getting a different type of tension. So one is going to be more disrupting than the other. So again, just keeping these things in mind when putting together your specialization phases is very, very important. And I guess the most important variable that we can look to manipulate is exercise selection and order. So exercise selection won't be the primary way that we specialize, because if you want to get bigger biceps, you're going to do bicep curls. No shit. It's like, yeah. Well, But we can look, like I mentioned, on a very, technical level at how we select exercises for the biceps and recognize that every muscle has a textbook action and function. So for the biceps, for example, it's elbow flexion. But people also forget that it, supinates the forearm, and they also forget that it flexes the shoulder. So if we want to maximize our bicep development, we might want to include, movements that train the bicep through supination and through shoulder flexion, as well as elbow flexion. And, for the most part, we want to train the muscle through exercises that train its highest force-producing function. So for the bicep, that's going to be elbow flexion. So just remember that whilst it does all these other fancy and funky things, its highest force-producing function is elbow flexion, which means that's where we're going to get the most amount of tension, and that's where we're going to get the most amount of growth. So the bulk of your exercises should train that primary function, but it's probably a good idea to sprinkle in a little bit of the supination and the shoulder flexion, just as an example. Now, in terms of exercise order, this is where we can really start to drive our adaptive and our performance resources towards these specific muscle groups that we want to specialize in, because usually when we train a muscle group, it's in a fatigued state. For example, most people train their calves at the end of their leg workout, and they're already fatigued from, playing a role in dorsiflexion during squats, through their hamstring curls, all these sorts of things. The calves get a lot of indirect stimulus. So exercise order is really useful, because if we bring the calves to the start of the workout, all of a sudden we are fresh, we're recovered, we are focused, we're cognitively, able to perform at our best. We're not, tired, sweaty, thinking about, posting our selfie on Instagram when we haven't even finished our session yet. We can dedicate more energy and more effort to that target muscle group, which is going to mean we get a better training effect. And this is a big one. We talk about volume, but what people don't realize is they need to place their current training volumes on the target muscle group. So people have really shitty technique, or they execute their training really poorly, which means they're not actually making the most or optimizing their current volumes. They need to get every fucking ounce of tension within the current volumes onto the target muscle group effectively, so they do maximize the training effect of their current volumes. And by placing exercises first in our workouts, this is when we can really start to do that. And I think it's very, very useful in specialization phases. And again, dedicating an entire day or session to training that muscle group. For example, I have a lot of my physique athletes who have really poorly developed calves. I will give them 2 calf sessions a week. For example, they will go in and they will train their upper body on a Monday morning, for example, and then they've got their second session for the day, which is just calves, and it's calves and abs, for example. So they'll go into the gym and they will train calves and abs after their upper body session. So they're completely fresh. Or in some cases, when I think that this person might be doing a very laborious job during the day, I will tell them, do your calf and ab training first in the morning, and then do your upper body later in the evening. So that way they haven't even fatigued their legs during the day, when they've been standing and working. And again, if you really want to specialize, and if you're an advanced athlete, you take your training seriously, you need to take these things into consideration, because everything will affect your training at this point. So exercise order is a big one, not just in the session, at the session level, but also within the week. So if you have a lagging muscle group and in this specialization phase, and you want to bring up your biceps, instead of performing your arm session on a Saturday at the end of the week, after you've just worked Monday to Friday, you're tired, you've performed 5 sessions, and you're absolutely spent, bring that session to the first thing Monday morning after the weekend when you're recovered and fresh, provided that you're not going out on the weekend drinking lots of beers and doing silly things. But that's going to be a good idea. So making sure you prioritize the session when you're performing the primary muscle group that you want to be building, and also the order within that session. So order within the microcycle, order within the session, really, really useful. And I guess another, it's not a variable, but it's more of a technique that we can start to manipulate when it comes to the specialization phases is just using some advanced overloading strategies, which again is more of a means of progression through the various phases. So what I like to do with my specialization phases is, phase one, like I said, we're just bringing volume down from the other muscle groups. We're trying to eke out progress on the current volumes, and we will manipulate exercise order and really just tweak and fine-tune exercise selection. So just pay a little bit more attention to that. Nothing stupid, but it's like cool, how can we make sure we get more damaging exercises, less damaging exercises, the relationship between those sorts of things. Phase two, then I really start to drive the intensity side of things. So I will push, RPEs up and up and up and up. We might also see small increments in volume depending on recovery. And then that third phase, this is where, again, we'll deload and then start to get into some advanced overloading techniques. So usually for the smaller muscle groups, such as the biceps, triceps, the delts, they do respond well to metabolite training. So this is when we're going to some metabolite work. And what I like to do for the metabolite work is start to include supersets. So not antagonist supersets, which is opposing muscle groups, but agonist supersets. So we might do, for example, an incline dumbbell curl into a preacher curl, and that can be excruciating, but work really well. And I did this on my delt specialization phase. I supersetted lateral delt with the posterior delt many times, and it worked really, really, really well. Things like doing my side raises into my face pulls. I also did my rear delts into my upright rows, things like that, where we're going from a compounded movement to an isolation movement. I really, really liked that. And another one I like to use is myo reps or cluster sets to then just, continue the training effect, get that metabolite build up, and it's just another way to get some effective training stimulus. And it's one of those things, it's like you're getting to the end of the training cycle, the specialization phase, like, fuck, let's just throw the kitchen sink at it and, make sure that we leave no stone unturned, because, when it's all said and done, you can rest, recover, and obviously, aim to maintain your gains, hopefully. So, yeah, man, I hope that covered everything.
Absolutely, man. I just, literally every point I have noted down, you just touched on, literally. And I'm glad that you brought up exercise form as well, because I think a lot of people just have a weak muscle group because they don't perform the technique on that muscle group well.
Yeah.
And for example, back development is weak because they're pulling with their arms and don't really know how to activate their lats and their rhomboids and traps. But yeah, definitely that was a super good summary. And I think you also touched on specialization for smaller muscle groups, and I would be interested in how you program specialization phases for smaller versus bigger muscle groups.
Yeah, I think just on average, those bigger muscle groups will take longer to recover, meaning you have to be a little bit more careful with how much volume you're dedicating towards those muscle groups. And some of the bigger muscle groups, what I like to do, instead of dedicating more volume to isolation exercises, obviously, I would just dedicate more volume to those big compound movements with, higher intensities of load, because I think, on average, the bigger muscle groups, typically fast twitch dominant, they respond quite well to, high amounts of tension, as opposed to duration of tension. So I think that's a really important distinction to make. But that's not the case for all muscle groups or all approaches. But I think just in general, if I want to get somebody's quads bigger and they're lagging a little bit, it's very useful to get them to squat a little bit more, as opposed to doing more leg extensions initially anyway. And then what I like to do over time is start to de-emphasize the squat and emphasize the leg extension, because I think there's both a time and place for every muscle group to develop through lower end rep ranges and higher end rep ranges. But for those bigger muscle groups, I just think because they usually have more insertions, and I guess the articulation of the muscle fibers is just a little bit more intricate so to speak. They do well with heavy loads, lots of tension. For example, the back. I think the back responds really, really well to some heavy weights, but it also responds well to really light weights. And because it's such a complex muscle, you do need to train it from multiple angles, and it's usually a good idea to start with these big muscle groups with the basics. So, just basic movement patterns, but heavy and high amounts of tension. And then see how much progress you can get out of that. And then once you have got, as much progress as you can out of those big main movements, then you can start to, like I said, de-emphasize the main movements a little bit and emphasize those isolation exercises.
Okay, so just in general, do you think what are your recommendation in terms of frequencies for smaller versus bigger muscle groups?
Yeah, so frequencies, is a big one, which I started to go on a completely different tangent and forgot to address the actual point I wanted to make, which was So yes, like I said, the big muscle groups just take a little bit longer to recover, generally speaking, so they might need to be trained a little bit less frequently. So, for example, I trained my arms up to 5 times a week in one of my specialization phases. I don't think I could train my legs 5 times a week. It wouldn't be very productive training. I think 3 times a week would probably be the upper limit for say the quads and the hamstrings. Whereas the calves could be almost trained every day. Realistically, if you have really weak calves, do like 3 to 5 sets of calf raises every day. If you're recovering from it, keep going. When you stop recovering, start to bring it down a little bit and give yourself a day's rest in between. But yeah, these smaller muscle groups are a little bit more type 2 dominant, could definitely recover very quickly and therefore be trained with higher frequency. So that's usually the primary distinction between muscle group size. But yeah, I think the big muscle groups do respond well to those big compound lifts, and focusing on those first, maxing out your development and progress on those, and then you can start to emphasize the isolation work and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely, and I find it super interesting that you just touch on calves and their recovery capacities, because in my experience it's also like just between sets they recover so fast. I can literally do like 30 or 60 seconds rest and they still recover, and I can perform my sets well again.
Yeah, it's exactly right, man. That's been my experience too.
Cool. Maybe we can also touch on how many muscle groups you generally combine, and for example, like something in your upper and something in your lower body, and if you in relation to training age, which might change that.
Yeah, so obviously I think there's a few ways to approach this, and I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong, as long as it's well thought out and it makes sense, and the training of or the specialization of one muscle group doesn't detract from the other muscle group that you're trying to also specialize. For example, if you're trying to specialize your back and your triceps, for example, that's not a very good idea, because you're going to have to do a lot of rowing work. Then you're also going to have to do a lot of pushing work, and that can exceed your recovery capacity quite quickly. Yeah. Whereas if you're trying to build your biceps and your triceps, it's like, well, that's not really going to detract from one another. So I think just making sure that the muscle group that you're training doesn't take away from the other muscle group that you're trying to specialize in is your first point in call. And if that's the case, then I think there's no limits or no rules as to how you configure this specialization phase and which muscle groups you do or don't include. You'll have your own muscle groups that you have weak points in, which need to be specialized. So, just saying that, you can only do arm specialization phase, but you can't do, say triceps and deltoids. It's like, well, you might need to specialize triceps and deltoids if you got a bodybuilding show in 12 months' time, you don't have fucking, time to wait until the perfect opportunity to, do another specialization phase where you pair up to different muscle groups. It's like, do what you need to do. Just make sure that you tick that primary box of that they don't take away from one another. But I do like the idea of making sure that it's a larger muscle group with a smaller muscle group. Two big muscle groups is not a good idea because that, again, you have a limited and finite amount of recovery capacity. You can't just do more and more and more and keep recovering, no matter how much you eat, no matter how much you sleep. There is a ceiling on how much you can recover, and that means there's a ceiling on how much you can adapt. So I also think that you should be pairing one muscle group with one small muscle group, or potentially two small muscle groups with one large muscle group, or you might even be able to do 2 to 3 small muscle groups. It's really going to depend, because there is a lot of overlap between muscle groups, and that's what people need to remember, is that when you're doing pushing movements, you're getting your triceps.
Yeah.
So you can actually specialize your phase that has your chest, your triceps, and then fuck it, why not do more bicep work too? So there you go. You've got chest, triceps, and biceps. So, I think people just need to think really pragmatically and logically about, how they structure things. I don't think there are any rules. I'd love to say that this is how you do it. And again, people hate, the gray and having, very convoluted ways of, getting to answers. People like, most people like, dichotomous thinking, black and white, do this, do that. But the reality is, you need to think about it. It's your body, it's your physique. So you should be putting some time and attention into the decisions you make with your training. And I think, provided that you aren't taking away from the recovery of either muscle group, and you consider the overlap between different muscle groups in terms of the tension, stimulus placed on them, then you're good to go. But as a general rule of thumb, I would say one large muscle group and 1 or 2 small muscle groups, or potentially 2 to 3 small muscle groups on their own.
Yeah, sounds like great advice. And I mean, we both know that programming is really an art, and like individualization is a huge part of it. So
huge.
Yeah, Jacob, I think that was actually pretty great, and we can now maybe touch quickly on your two specialization phases. Like you did one for your arms and one for your shoulders, for just like a real world example and how you actually did it and programmed it.
Yeah, so last year I actually did a 10-month specialization phase. So for my arms, and I literally didn't stop making progress. Like my arms just kept fucking growing and kept growing. So I just kept running with it. I didn't change anything. I took deloads. I auto-regulated when I needed to, but I set up the microcycle and I just let it run because this was after a powerlifting stint. So I'd finished my powerlifting. And it was just, straight into bodybuilding. I got back some of the muscle that I lost in, the smaller muscle groups, because in powerlifting, you don't do a lot of bicep curls, a lot of direct tricep work. And then, after 3 months, I just kept gaining. And after 2-3 months of that, there was still some gains and I just kept going. So I really set up the microcycle well. There was 15 sets of direct arm work split across 3 days initially, and then I had 15 sets of indirect work through, close grip bench press, supinated pull-ups, my rows and things like that, dips. So again, the exercise you select for your compounds, if you're trying to bring up a, muscle group that primarily acts, in an isolation function, such as the biceps and triceps, the compound movements that you perform can play a big, big role in that. And then, I was just aiming to progress through repetitions first and then load. So I used double and triple progressions for these movements that I'd selected with those volumes. And dude, I made some pretty wicked gains. I wrote an article
I've seen the pics
on that and how I structured that. It's on our website for those who want to look at it a little bit further. But that was that one. And then after that, I actually did a hamstring focus phase, and I got my hamstring volume up to about 15 to 20 sets a week. And again, I just focused on the exercise selection. So I'd always traditionally performed Romanian deadlifts and hamstring curls. So they were just the two movements that I included. But I started including good mornings and RDLs with my hamstring curls, and I also did some glute ham raises in there as well. So I was just really trying to, get well-developed hamstrings, and that was pretty successful. So that was more of an exercise selection tweak in that phase. The volume went up a little bit, but it was just moving the order of those exercises too. So I'd always performed squats, then RDLs, or done my hamstring work at the back of my workout. I just brought that up to the front of my workout, and it was actually really impressive in terms of, I think it's useful, when you get to a level of advancement where you can start to, you just know if a muscle group's getting bigger. Like, you really do. If you're objective about your training and you know your body well, and I know people say this, it's a bit of a throwaway term, but I know my body. But if you're actually a critical thinker, you're objective, and you know your shit, you can also know your body, and I think that makes sense to be able to know your body. And when I do a specialization phase, a good proxy for me, very subjective proxy, it's not always going to be right, but if I can feel the muscle group more and I have a better connection with that muscle group, like better mind-muscle connection, not during training, but just during the day, like if I flex my hamstrings and it's like, oh, fuck, like I've got just a bit more awareness about that muscle now, and it just feels bigger, like, when I put my hands on it, when I'm wearing shorts and things like that, that's a good sign that, some gains have been made. In that phase, my hamstrings, I was just like, holy shit, I've never felt them like this. And I, had pretty well-developed hamstrings. And then following that, I did shoulder-focused phase. So that specialization phase was all about the delts. And again, it was just exercise selection. So I had 4 primary exercises, lateral raise with a dumbbell and a cable leaning. I also did upright rows, rear delt flies, and face pulls. So there were 5 exercises, but 4 movements. And in that phase, this was a fun phase. I really jacked up the volume. I think I got up to, I can't remember off the top of my head, it would have been about 25 sets per week, distributed through all of those exercises. And I was training my delts 4 times a week, and then I got it, 3 times a week at the start, and then at the end I got it up to 4. And like I said, I used those advanced overloading strategies with the supersets, and some myo reps and cluster sets for the delts. And that was a really, really fun cycle. And I noticed, like, when you're in an off season and you're not shredded, you don't have as much cap at your shoulder because body fat obviously flattens you out a little bit. But at the end of that phase, I gained I think it was 1.5 kilos, maybe 2 kilos. And so I gained weight. I didn't lose weight, which is important. I gained about 2 kilos, and I had a significantly improved cap at my delts, especially my rear delt. So again, that was just a really good measure that, I'd made some progress, and it was really fun. So in terms of how I structure them, real world examples, you just set up the microcycle right. You go through your big variables, your volume, frequency, intensity, exercise selection, exercise order. You plug in your progression schemes, whether you're doing single, double, triple progression, that's always exercise dependent, and then you go from there. So I think that's all I have to say on that. I hope I answered that, man.
Yes, sounds really great. I have some good experiences with 4 times a week shoulder and arm training as well. And I remember back in the days, it sounds like I'm super old, but you know what I mean. It was in 2016, on the 3DMJ conference. Alberto Nunez actually did a physique assessment with me, and he just told me, dude, you need some arms and some delts, and he just recommended me what Brian recommended to you, just splitting up your current volumes on more days. And I remember I just did 4 or 5 days a week arm training, and it actually improved my arms significantly without actually hiring the volumes, and just by having better quality of volumes in those different more days.
100%, man.
I will actually make sure that I link the specialization article in the description you just mentioned.
Awesome, man.
Cool. So I think that was pretty much it from my side. If you don't have anything to say about specialization training or anything that you want to add, you can now plug again your social media and stuff. I'm definitely happy to link that down in the description.
Yeah, no, I'm spent, man. That's all all I've got on specialization phases, in a general sense anyway. But yeah, you can follow JPS, Health and Fitness, on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and my personal Instagram is just Jacob Skepis _ JPS. And yeah, nothing else to plug, man. Hope everyone found that useful.
I definitely think so. I will link down everything in the description. And yeah, Jacob, it's been great, and definitely want to thank you again for being here and taking the time out of your day. I remember in March it was actually 5 a.m. or something for you, and right now it's 2 a.m. for me. So you kind of got your revenge.
All about that hustle, bro.
Yeah. And yeah, man. Thank you again, and see ya.
Not a problem, Jean. Thank you for having me on.